Okay, good morning everyone, and welcome to the second of four online sessions that comprise this year's MaaS Scotland annual conference. Many thanks to you all for taking the time to join us this morning. Before we get started, just a little bit of housekeeping, although I'm sure you all know the drill by now. You'll notice that you're all on mute, and I would ask you if you could keep it that way for the duration of the session. And it's probably a good idea as well if you turn your cameras off too, just in the interests of bandwidth. That said, we do want the session to be as interactive as possible, so we'd encourage you to use the chat functionality to introduce yourself, to make contacts, and most importantly, to post any questions and comments that you might have throughout the duration of this session. So, welcome to today's session, which is about exploring transport behaviours, and more specifically, how MaaS can support the more positive transport choices that will be required if we were to create that sustainable, low carbon transport future that I think we all aspire to. Before we go any further, I just want to say a few thanks to our sponsors, to Cubic, IBI and Enterprise, our event sponsors. Their continued support for this event, both this year and last year, is much appreciated. I also want to thank Technology Scotland's corporate sponsors, who are Enigma People Solutions and Scintilla, for their continued support across all of our networks, including MaaS Scotland. For an organisation like ours, this support really is crucial, so we thank them for that. Okay, briefly, and with apologies for those who may have heard me go through this 100 times before, I just want to touch on who we are at MaaS Scotland. We were formed about 4 years ago, really to be the focal point for mobility as a service activities in Scotland. And we're about facilitating initiatives that will deliver the benefits of MaaS to Scotland. We are now around 75 public and private sector organisations from across the MaaS supply chain, and that does make us one of the largest networks of our kind in the world. This is the kind of blink and you'll miss it list of our members. So if you're one of our members, you get a chance there to see your own logo, but that's who we are. Quite a diverse bunch of organisations, all sharing that same goal. And as well as building that network of organisations to help us to deliver MaaS, we are also focused on facilitating projects that will generate the evidence base that we know is required to prove, if you like, the positive impact of MaaS in Scotland. And we've been doing that through supporting Scottish Government and Transport Scotland through the MaaS Investment Fund, and now 4 projects being supported through that, but we're obviously keen to support all other projects as well. Alongside the projects, we're also aware there's a lot of conversation that needs to be had around how we create the right landscape for MaaS in future to both upscale and develop MaaS further. So we work with our members and key stakeholders in discussions around policy, regulation, legislation, data, user engagement, you name it. And we do most of this through our special interest groups, which I know a lot of you are already involved in. And then hopefully when we do all of that and bring it all together, its overriding aim is to position Scotland as a global lead for MaaS development and a testbed for MaaS pilots within Scotland. Okay, so on to today's session and the conference as a whole. And as you'll know, if you were at last week's session, really there was only one show in town when it came to building a theme around this year's conference. And COP26 is going to throw the UK and Scotland in particular into international focus, and we will be at the centre of global discussions around how we tackle climate emergency. And that places greater emphasis on our own net zero targets and strategic framework to allow us to reach those. And I think we'd all agree that transport has to be a key component of that strategic framework. We all know that it's now Scotland's biggest source of greenhouse gas emissions. And while the contribution from other sectors is dropping, transport has remained relatively flat over the last 20 years or so. So it's clear that if we want to meet those net zero targets for 2045, then we're going to have to make a significant inroad into transport's contribution to that. And that's going to require a whole range of solutions, of course, technological, cultural, political, but we firmly believe that MaaS must be a key component of that. Why? Well, because at the heart is, I guess, of MaaS is a goal to catalyse behavioural change relating to transport and support that modal shift that we know is required. And that's really going to be key. Only through a significant national change in national transport behaviours can we hope to make the reductions in transport emissions that we're going to require. So how do we do that? Well, that's partly what we're here today to talk about, and I'm delighted that we're joined by 4 panel experts who will help guide us through some of the key considerations relating to future behavioural change and transport. Each of our panelists are going to be given 5 minutes just to introduce themselves and give us some opening remarks so you can understand the perspectives that they are bringing to today's session. And then we'll have a good amount of time, actually. We should have just over an hour, or around an hour, to then really dig into some of the detail through a panel session and Q&A. So we also need your engagement in this too. This is designed to be an interactive session, and while the numbers in this call make a kind of open all mics approach a little unwieldy, we do very much encourage you to tell us what you think through the chat function and make your comments, and most importantly, to ask your questions of our panelists. We have a whole list of pre-prepared questions, as you might expect, to make sure that the session runs smoothly, but that's a bit boring. It'd be much more interesting if the questions came from our audience at home. So please do put those in, or if not a question, maybe there's a comment that will stoke some more discussion. Okay, so in the spirit of that interactivity, we're going to start with a poll. And that's not just because I've recently found the poll functionality in Zoom, although it is partly that, but also I think we have, nearly 60 people on this call, and I think it's a good way of understanding, I guess, the perspectives of our audience and where the lay of the land is with our audience. I'm going to attempt to start this poll. If you just give me a second. Hang on, I'm going to have to do 2 things here, so ignore that. And okay, so the question on the poll is, in your opinion, what is the biggest challenge to achieving the required change in transport behaviours that we will need to meet our net zero ambitions? Now, I know that you'll be tempted to select more than one of these answers, but I'm kind of forcing you to pick one for the sake of this exercise. So I'm going to give you a bit of time just to read through those and have a little look, and I'll talk you through them as we're going through it. Is it around developing a clear and consistent message to the public? Do we need to think more about inclusive and accessible transport? Is that the way that we pull this through? What about the impact of COVID-19? Is that going to be a relatively short-term blip, or do we think it's going to have a fundamental change to the way we engage with transport over the next 10 years? Is it maybe as simple as just improving the infrastructure? Is it as easy as that? Do we just have to have the infrastructure in place, the assets in place to allow people to transport? Do we have to have the right policy and legislative mix, that mix of carrot and sticks that supports those transport behavioural changes that we want? Is it as simple as just we have to develop transport solutions that meet people's needs? Is that fundamentally what it's all about? Or how much focus should we put on car users? We know that is a major component of our emissions. So how much effort do we have to put into that? So I'm going to give you just a couple of minutes to go through that. We've had, I can see it ticking up now. So we've got 34 people, we have now 35, so it's ticking up. I think I'm not going to let this stop until we've got at least 75 to 80% of people have created, have submitted something. I realise for some of you we're maybe about the 3rd window down at the moment on your computer, but I'm going to force you to find us and put something into the poll. Good. Okay. So what's coming through at the moment? Well, developing transport solutions that meets people's needs is the winner at the moment. Interestingly, not too far behind that is the focus on the car user. So I think that's something we'll touch on in the discussion as we go forward. Okay, we seem to have sort of dried up submissions there. There are still 14 of you out there who haven't submitted something, although I will be part of that number, I have to confess. So, but we'll leave it there. So let me just end that, and then I can share the results back and talk through. So, so yes, it's clear there. So developing those transport solutions to people's needs and focusing on the car user seems to be kind of leading the way. Behind that is a reasonably stable mix. Interestingly, not only one person really sees COVID as having a significant longer term impact. That's interesting in itself. Maybe we'll touch on that a little bit later on as well. Now, I know that we've only given you 7 options there, and there'll be plenty of people at home who think we've missed something major there. So if that is the case, please do drop that into the chat, drop your comments on that poll or anything that we might have missed into that. That's the way we'll get the chat rolling on that as well. But there's some interesting points there that I think we'll bring out in the panel session, particularly around engaging with the car user, and also how do we develop those transport solutions, and how does MaaS help to support that. So thank you all for your engagement there. I'll stop sharing that now. Okay, so that now brings us on to our panel session. And as I say, we're going to run our panel session back to back. And so we're going to have our 4 panelists. We'll each have 5 minutes by way of introduction. And we're going to start with Alex Bardella, who's head of product at Unicard. So Alex, over to you.
Thanks, Ali. Morning, everyone. Thanks a lot for coming out. And thanks a lot, Ali, for inviting me to be here. Let me just share my slides. You good? You can see that?
Yep, all good.
Brilliant. So yeah, hi guys, I'm head of product at Unicard. If you're not familiar with who we are, we're a transport ticketing and technology specialist. We work with local authorities and bus operators from Land's End to John O'Groats. I'm very pleased that we can say that. The map on the right shows the areas that we operate in. And specifically with regards to MaaS, I think our 3 biggest sort of flagships are we provide the HOPS backend for Transport Scotland, so the back office that manages all of the concessionary bus travel in Scotland, and we work with 2 out of the 5 future transport zones in England, those being Solent Transport and Transport for West Midlands. So we're the ticketing supplier to the mobility as a service initiatives that they've got going on there. In terms of sort of what my expertise is today, as you can tell from the beard and the glasses, like I'm a big nerd. I do the technology stuff. So everything from account-based ticketing to smart ticketing to data integration is all my jam. But we're also very keen on things like concessionary travel, obviously from our current customer set, and particularly the challenges around integrating transport types such as rail, which is a huge component of mobility as a service, but one that has typically done its own thing in the past. Now, when Ali asked me to do these remarks, the question that he asked us to all think about was, what are the key considerations for behavioural change in mobility as a service? Obviously, this is a huge topic, but for me, I think this can be summed up with a different question, which is whose behaviour are we actually trying to change? And whenever I see a MaaS scheme, basically these are the questions that I run through with that to see whether I think they're fully considering the full scope of what needs to happen, particularly when we talk about net zero, because I think that's a different challenge to, for example, supporting active travel goals or just pumping up the numbers so that the scheme looks like a success. And I want to sort of illustrate that by saying, if you picture in your mind your mobility as a service customer, say you're trying to choose the picture for your bus advert launching the scheme, I think we'd all probably agree this is probably a fairly reasonable image to use. You know, if we think about the sorts of customer we're trying to reach, you know, they're on a bus. There's a good mix of ages there. You know, we're not only focusing on the 25-year-olds. They're all staring at their smartphones because obviously MaaS wouldn't really exist in a smartphone-free world. But there is a problem here. There is a problem with this image, and I wonder. Oh, it's a fairly full bus as well, so clearly they're in an urban area. But the problem, of course, is that these are not our customers, because these people are already on a bus. They're already public transport users. And if we're talking about net zero, you know, moving someone from a bus to a bike is really not going to do anything. You know, maybe we could run slightly fewer buses, but ultimately that's not who we need to be thinking about. So for me, the key is that MaaS needs to broaden its horizons. And that's what I want to just quickly talk about, is sort of 5 or 6 different people we need to be considering when we think about behavioural change, because that for me is the key. We need to be thinking bigger and wider and larger. So the first thing, we mentioned it just now, was car users. For me, this is number one. If your MaaS scheme does not have an offering, a deliverable for car users, I feel like in terms of net zero, it is unfortunately destined to not achieve the goals that it sets out to do. If there is no offering for car users, and even worse, if they are demonized, then they're not going to engage with the scheme. They're not going to install the app. You're not going to have a channel to reach them and inspire that behavioral change. Now, obviously, it's a balance. We don't want to make it too easy to drive into the town centre, because that might encourage more people in the car. But there has to be something, whether it's around parking. In the West Midlands, they offer a scrappage scheme, so you can trade in your old polluting car for £3,000 of public transport credit, and you can then use that to get around. That's part of the Clean Air Zone initiative. So we've got to think of something to reach those car customers. We can't just ignore them and focus on people who are already opted into public transport. Now, I think you're going to hear a bit more about this later, so I'll keep it brief. But rural passengers are hugely important as well. What is the offering for them? Around, I think, 3 million, 4 million, depending on how you slice it, Scots live in sort of outside of one of the major urban conurbations. And actually, what's called accessible rural is growing 2.5 times faster than urban populations in Scotland. It's lower overall, but it's growing faster. So what is the offering there? Fun fact, this is Corrour Station. It's the only station in the UK that you can't access by road. Also famous from the film Trainspotting. So now, I'm not saying every station is like this, but that's the sort of mindset that we need to have. Concessionary travellers, what is the offering for them? How are we integrating them into the scheme? Because again, typically the market doesn't really like to think about concessionary travels. They tend to get forgotten because they're not that profitable and they're quite awkward. Around a third of Scotland's population qualify for free bus travel currently, and in the new year we're going to be launching the under 22s free travel scheme, which is another 1 million young people who are going to come on board with that. Now, if you haven't got a way of integrating them with the travel scheme, you're not going to succeed, because you need to get them early. And if they're competing, if your MaaS scheme doesn't offer something better than free travel, then they're not going to opt into it. So again, what are we thinking about for concessionary travels? They're kind of invisible as a society, and we need to be thinking about how we can support their behavior changes as well. The underbanked or the unbanked. So there's about 1.3 million people in the UK who don't have a bank account. There's about 2 million who prefer to use cash on a daily basis. And there's about 14 million adults who suffer from some kind of financial exclusion, which is, I think, crazy for a developed economy in 2021, but that's another story. So the challenge we have is, I think it's pretty clear that we're all seem to be moving towards contactless EMV as the token of choice for mobility as a service. I think certainly as a consumer, I know it's the one that I favour, even though I work for a business that produces smart cards. But that's a real challenge when we're thinking about those people who don't have a contactless card, who aren't, particularly financially savvy. And unfortunately, they're more likely to be low income. They're more likely to be minority or immigrant communities. So again, as local authorities, we have to be thinking about how can we support these people in a move to a cashless and contactless EMV based future. Some things you can look at here in the West Midlands. Again, we offer the ability to top up your card at a pay point, so you can top it up at a newsagent or a post office and store that as credit with cash. Similarly, I know some councils are experimenting with prepaid MasterCards to offer a way of, again, directly sort of incentivizing people to opt into the financial system. And the final person I want to plea for you guys to think about, and I'm sure we have some operators on the call, is the operators. I think in the UK we have quite an interesting and unique situation. I know we work with certain European MaaS providers, and they're always really surprised at how much power and influence the operators have in the UK over the transport mix. And again, I really think we need to be thinking about the operators' needs, thinking about their behaviours, and how we get them fully on board with schemes. Because ultimately, if you're the bus operator in a city and you're being asked to join a MaaS scheme, it's almost certain that you're going to be losing some revenue, because we're hoping to move people onto other forms of transport. And if not, you're certainly giving up some of those customers that you've you've acquired. So there has to be an equitable exchange here. Otherwise, the operators will just opt out because they have shareholders and they have a business to run, and then you're stuffed. So there has to be a fair offering to them to change the status quo. And it's not just the big operators, it's the new operators as well. The scooter providers, the bike share companies. Unfortunately, they are venture-backed startups, the majority of them. They need to be able to show a return on all the money that they've invested in customer acquisition and data development. And so if we're just expecting them to give that all up, essentially for free for the privilege of operating in our area, that's not going to work. They're going to fight against it. So we have to think of a way of looking at their needs and their behaviors and again factoring that into our change. So just to leave you with a closing thought, for me, for MaaS to be successful, it's about solving the conflict between what the market is delivering, which is, ideally what is easiest and what is most commercially effective, and what we actually need as a society, the people that are difficult to reach, the people that don't make a lot of money. Ultimately, if we're talking about successful mobility as a service, we're talking about net zero. Those have to be the people that we go after, not just the low-hanging fruit. Thank you.
That's brilliant, Alex. That's a great kick-off. Always great to see a picture of Corner Station. That brings back lots of happy childhood memories. So thanks for that, Alone. But I think also you touched on a lot of different topics there around inclusivity, around working with the unbanked, with rural areas, and with car users. I think all of these are going to come out a little bit more throughout the other presentations and definitely in the panel session at the end as well. I'm sure these are areas that people at home or in their offices will have strong opinions on as well. So please do put those into the chat as well, and we'll touch on that later on. So, okay, on to our second panelist today is Beata Kubitz. Beata is a transport consultant with experience in future mobility and the role it plays in carbon reductions. I think to a number of you, she may also be known as the author of the MaaS survey, which she is part of along with Landor. So, Beata, over to you.
Hello, everyone. I'm just doing this amazing screen sharing business. Right, we can get started. So, what I'd like to talk about is mobility as a service and how it tends to have been targeted at cities. A lot of the commercial providers, both for new transport and mobility service, tend to look to those high density areas and look at the maximum gain from the maximum number of people. And actually, the thing that I have considered over the last sort of year, when I've been doing some research for the Foundation for Integrated Transport, which has been funded by them and with a bit of the contribution per down mobility in terms of being able to look at their data and do some work on more rural solutions, is how cities aren't really necessarily that urban. And we tend to sort of like look at our cities in the UK and go, oh, it's got 1 million people, 2 million people. But actually that density is very unevenly distributed. I live close to Manchester in England, and it's my nearest city, and I kind of look over the border and yes, it's 2.2 million people. It likes to boast of its enormous population, but actually only 600,000 of those are really in a very dense area. The World Bank thinks of cities as having 1,500 people or more in a square kilometre of land, and Oldham in the north of Manchester doesn't even have that. So it's very diverse, and this sort of diversity means that it's incredibly lumpy. And so lumpy cities mean that you've got little population densities with quite big spaces in between them, and then this transport tends to mimic that. So what I've been thinking about is why people, what the barriers to mobility as a service are in terms of how transport is distributed vis-a-vis population, why people make the journeys they do, which is very closely interlinked. So in Manchester, 157,000 people arrive in the centre of Manchester by car daily, outside of the pandemic, obviously. But only some of those, only a quarter of those come from actually within the borough. The rest of them come from this very dispersed area right the way across England, almost as far as Scotland. That might even be the borders in the north. So people drive into central Manchester from quite large distances. And I want to look at kind of what's motivating these driving behaviours. So I looked at Bolton. I mean, Bolton is sort of middle of, not just north of the centre of Manchester. It's got, you know, 250,000 residents. It's reasonably dense across the, on average, but again, it's incredibly lumpy. And you get these journeys of sort of 10 miles that people will make across very low density areas to get between to high density areas. Or they'll get in the train into central Manchester, and that involves quite often driving to stations. And why do they do these things? So what I've been doing is interviewing people, and the kinds of reasons that they come up with are really interesting. It's about public transport deficits. So what's stopping people using mobility as a service in my from my research is really deficits in public transport. Things, public transport taking significantly longer than driving a car. A 10-mile drive from a sort of outlying area of Bolton will take up to half an hour, quarter of an hour to half an hour in a car. But a bus, it might take an hour to an hour and a half. And you know, you've got 40 different stops for this one bus along a corridor to get to, and two changes. One change to get from a residential area to a commercial area of Bolton. Or you can try cycling. And someone else I interviewed basically gave me a great, I love cycling and I cycle daily practically, but his cycle was taking over motorway junctions and through dual carriageways. And this kind of thing, you cannot expect people to do those sorts of things just to pursue a different behaviour. And so, because I think we're seeing lots of influxes into cities from these much more dispersed areas, we really need to look at what kind of provision we are making beyond cities. So the thing that I've had the privilege of access to is looking over the border, over the channel into France at schemes that have been run by Padam Mobility, and they've let me have a look at some of their schemes and see how those connect different populations into urban areas. So this is a trial where a minibus was enabled to collect people from outlying areas around Cherbourg and connect them into colleges, schools and public transport corridors in Cherbourg. It was very interesting because it was the first time that these people had had access to public transport at all. And some of the things that they found that were really exciting were that people were stopping ferrying their children around. Quite often to take a child to guides or scouts is 4 individual car journeys, whereas these people were able to put their children onto a minibus that collected them. It was summoned by app. It didn't have to be summoned by app, but it was app operated. Kids were really happy using the app. So suddenly you're cutting out car journeys by providing alternative forms of transport. So that was quite exciting. Paris, again, Paris is very similar to Manchester apart from size, in that it's got a dense central area and then a much less dense urban area. And again, this is using demand responsive transport to connect people into the central transport zones, into the main lines which take people into the central transport zones, enabling the mayor to keep banning cars from the centre of Paris. So it plays together works together very clearly. And then in Nantes, you have an area where you've got lots of villages connecting into the central town, and people enabling people to take mainline services into towns. Again, looking at the data, there were trips of sort of seem to average about 12 kilometres just to get people to a station. And that's the kind of journey that if you have lots and lots of stops on a bus, it really doesn't work out in terms of the time that a passenger will take to get from their home to a station. So demand responsive transport provides lots of different solutions, and tying in these less dense areas into good transport provision, I think, is one of the absolute essentials to be able to make MaaS happen. And we can't just target the centre of cities, we have to look at the diaspora, the people outside of the cities that need to get into them. Just to summarise, I don't think this is a silver bullet. We really need to look from a very fundamental level at where people are, how people get out of their homes, the pavements, the cycleways, the traffic calming measures that mean that people are confident to leave their homes and get onto a bus, get to a train, cycle to work. And I think, you know, this means that we really need to look at our public realm as part of mobility as a service, not just the transport provision. And then we also need to look at those slightly longer journeys and how we provide journeys over dispersed areas to make sure that people are connected so that they can give up their cars. Because at the moment, we are asking people to give up their cars, but for enormous time penalties and sometimes enormous cost as well. And we can't do that. In order to make mobility as a service work, we really have to have services that are provided on the ground. And those are the things that mean that we'll actually get behaviour change. And I think Alex was talking about this. We have to look at the drivers. We can't just say, you must wear a hair shirt, you take an extra 2 hours a day to get to work and back, because people can't do that. They have kids, they have shopping, they have parents, they have responsibilities, and they may even want to do hobbies and relax. So yeah, we need to make sure that MaaS ties together people, not just in city centres, but right the way around in these less urban areas, and makes a solution that's suitable for everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Beata. I liked that kind of phrase about, you know, lumpiness, even applying to cities. I think that's but it's such a good phrase, because I think it really does illustrate the point that one of the great difficulties, I guess, of the transport network, particularly in Scotland, but elsewhere as well, is that lumpiness of population, which makes it very difficult. And I also think it was good that you brought up that sort of you know, cost and convenience barriers to other modes as well, which I think is just something that we simply cannot ignore. And I think both of those, and depending who you speak to, one might trump the other, but they are major considerations as people plan their transport journeys. Okay, plenty to digest and think about there ahead of the panel session, but we'll move on to our third speaker now, who is Melinda Mathias, who is the environment discipline lead at TRL, and with lots of experience in new mobility services and MaaS. So Melinda, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Ali, and thank you everyone for joining. And just while I get my screen share up and running, I'm quite amazed to see the geographical coverage of all the people online. So special thanks and shout out to those who are up at odd times of the day to join this session. I think it just shows that we still have quite a lot to discuss about MaaS. Have I managed to share my screen? Question.
Yes, perfect.
I always seem to struggle with that. So my name is Melinda Mathias, and I am the lead of the environment discipline within TRL. And for those of you who don't know TRL, we are a transportation research organization, and we look at the whole palette of transportation questions. So we look at safety, technology, behavior, transportation assets, environment, data, and software solutions. So we look at kind of the whole transportation system. So I wanted to kick off by just touching upon why we are talking about behavior change. So why do we want to change behavior in the first place? As Ali and Alex and various people have already mentioned, one of the targets is to reduce emissions reductions and achieve the net zero target. So an environmental consideration of why we want to change behavior. But besides that, there's also other factors that we should keep in mind. One of them is the economy. So we want to decrease congestion, the amount of time people spend in their vehicles in traffic jams. It took me 2 hours to get to my office this morning, and I can definitely attest to I could have done better things with those 2 hours that I was sitting in my car. And also better use of road space. We could be turning them into green space. We could be turning them into on-street markets. We could be turning them into various other areas. And then the third aspect is health. So especially now with COVID and with the new way of working, people are moving less and less. We're working from home, and then we get into our cars and go to the office. So using MaaS and trying to change people's behavior to use more active travel modes can be also another objective, another aim. And I'm sure there's a lot of other ones which I haven't captured, but these are 3 things that we should keep in mind, that it's not just the environment, but there's also other things why we want to change people's behavior. Because we need to keep these objectives in mind, because that will help us define how we want to change that behavior. So for example, potentially prioritizing active travel over a taxi journey when you're talking about MaaS. So things like these questions need to be kept in mind. So part of the solution is a more modal shift away from private vehicle use to shared and active travel. And that's really where MaaS comes in, and this discussion around what role MaaS can play in this. So first, I just wanted to touch upon the potential of MaaS. So this is really important to understand that this is the potential of what MaaS could do. It's not necessarily what MaaS is already doing. So the first one is that it can simplify multimodal transport through streamlined planning and payment. So this is one of the aims behind MaaS, to make it easy to use different types of transportation modes, to make it easy for me to, rather than sitting in my car all day, to take a train and then hop on a bike share to get to my destination, simplifying that journey. Then it also has the potential to expand users' consideration set. I'll touch on what that is, and to introduce new modes. So consideration set is the different types of transportation modes that you as an individual or as a user even consider using. So it's what you're thinking of to choose between. So for some people, certain transportation modes may not even be in their consideration set, like they're not even thinking about those as options. But MaaS has the potential to introduce these new transportation modes into people's consideration sets, because it's making it easy for them to use, or it's potentially even introducing new transportation modes that they may have not previously understood or even knew how to access. And a good example for this is shared transportation, or for example, bike sharing service. A person may understand that they're in the city and may have seen them around, but actually have no idea how to access this. And by introducing it through a MaaS application, it has the potential to introduce this into that person's consideration set, because it's popping it up as an option. Oh, just go over here, use your app to access this bike, and then you can hop on it and use it. So it's introducing it and introducing this new transportation mode into their consideration set. And then MaaS also has, the third point is that MaaS has the potential to be a vessel to deliver demand management interventions. So you could use MaaS as a way to, for example, decrease the cost of let's say public transport or some other transportation mode. This is a very tricky question. I'm sure there'll be a debate afterwards, but I just wanted to point out that it has the potential to do this. It doesn't mean that it's already doing it. It doesn't mean that it 100% should do it, but it has the potential to do this. But what's important to point out is that none of this will automatically happen. A lot of it will depend on the design of the specific scheme, and the impact will very heavily depend on people's prior behavior and location characteristics. So every city, every area, whether we're talking about city or rural area or anything in between, has very unique characteristics, and individuals have very different travel habits and travel behavior. Some of them may be easier to shift, some of them may be more difficult, but these are just things to keep in mind. And then I just put together this slide, which is a little bit ad hoc, but some aspects that I think are worth considering and potentially are good topics for us to discuss in the rest of the session. So one of the things is the factors that influence user uptake of mobility as a service. So first point is that understanding around MaaS still needs to be improved. Over the last couple of years, I was involved in several different surveys where we were trying to understand people's attitudes towards mobility as a service, both surveys and in a qualitative setting. And what we found is that the actual understanding of what MaaS is and how it works and the potential benefits that it can give is still not fully understood. And it's something that for those of us out there who have been doing MaaS related research, we all appreciate. It's really hard to explain, because it's hard to explain for people in the transportation profession, let alone to a regular Joe. So that still needs to be improved. That's going to help with continuous messaging and trying to simplify what exactly this means. And the second point is that user expectations around the actual technical solution, so we can talk about it as an app, is very high. So in these user studies that we did, everyone was expecting it to be as good as the top service out there. I put Uber there as an example, up for debate whether that's the top out there, but some people were referring it to that they'll only use a MaaS app if it works as easily as Uber does. Or other applications that are really, really user-friendly. So this makes it very tricky to do trials, because usually when you do trials, you have alpha beta versions of a MaaS application, which are not quite there yet, and that may drive potential users away because it's not as good as what they're comparing it to. Then the third point is that we need to take into account different user groups. And this is something that Alex mentioned already. So for example, those who are unbanked, underbanked, and those who are technologically illiterate. So there's a lot of different other user groups as well that need to be talked about. I'm not going to go into too much detail about this because the previous presenters already mentioned, but that's again is something that we need to take into account. And the second main point that I wanted to mention is about using MaaS to change behavior. So again, this is something that was mentioned before, but we actively need to engage car users. Otherwise, we have the risk of negative shifts. So it's again this question about who are we trying to shift? Who are we going to try to change? Whose behavior do we want to try to change? And if we change behavior of people who, let's say, already cycle to work, that's not exactly what we're trying to do. We're trying to change the behavior of all those people who are on their own, sitting in their cars day after day. Those are the people who you want to change. So it's really important to understand what exactly we're trying to achieve. And this comes back to the objectives that I talked about at the start, to understand what we're trying to achieve. Then the second point is that people are creatures of habit, and travel behavior is a habitual thing. If you're commuting every day, you usually take the exact same road, you do the exact same thing. Not because that's the best, but just because that's what you're used to and you don't need to think about it. And this means that changing behavior is actually quite difficult in some cases. And it may be easier to do this when other changes are happening in people's lives. Let's say they're changing a workplace or they're moving home, when there's already quite a bit of turmoil going on. So adding on another aspect of that may be a bit easier. That may not be the only case, but it's another consideration to take into account that travel behavior is habitual in most cases. Another option may be to try to tackle those journeys which aren't habitual journeys, so aren't, let's say, your regular commute, but ones when you're going on holiday or you're doing something slightly different, and try to change those behaviors first, or get them to engage with a MaaS service through that, and then transition to the more habitual journeys. And then the third point is to consider combining mobility as a service with harder measures, or sticks as we sometimes call them, to achieve the most desirable behavior change. Again, this is a topic that can be debated for a very long time, and that's purposefully why I put this on, so that we hopefully have a good discussion about this. But whether MaaS on its own is enough to do behavior change, I personally don't think so. But again, this is up for debate. So maybe combining MaaS together with other harder measures, let's say ones that make using car less desirable, may achieve a better behavior change. And again, I just wanted to point out that no one size will fit all. Every area is different, and there is still so much unknown. I've been researching MaaS for 8 years, a very, very long time. And we still have so many outstanding questions. And the more answers we get, the more questions we get. So it's kind of a never-ending research cycle. And so more research is needed as MaaS and the concept around it slightly adapts and changes. So that was my 2 cents for now. So I'll hand back to you, Ali. Thank you.
Right, Melinda, thank you. Lots more fuel for discussion later on. And I think, yes, we will definitely explore how MaaS sits alongside a kind of, a toolbox of other measures, perhaps, that might help in terms of transport behaviours and that balance of carrot and sticks that we spoke about before. So excellent. Okay, on to our final speaker then, before we move on to our Q&A. And that is Kate Barnard, who is founder and director of Enjoy the Air Limited and director of Whatbox, and comes from both an engineering and an entrepreneurship background. So Kate, over to you.
Thanks. I'm just going to share this and hope that you... Hopefully now you should see it all as a big screen.
That looks great.
Good. I'll move me out of the way. So we are Enjoy the Air. Kate Barnard, I took this photo. I thought I'd put this in so that we would feel some kinship with, I can't stop it going now, feel some kinship with Scotland, because it's raining. Oh, see, I'm not very good at this at all. Let's stop it. Try again. Oh, look at that. we tried all this and it worked brilliantly. Let's see if I can do it.
The joy of live television.
It is, blimey. So we've been founded a year, and it's doing it again now, isn't it? I'll do it this way, I think. We've been founded a year, and our aim is around really that inner urban environment. The other people have spoken about mobility as a whole across the whole area, but we wanted to concentrate particularly on the city. I have a background of engineering, having been in corporate for a couple of decades. And I've started this company, and I love the technical side of it, actually, and completely different technical to how I was previously, but I'm still working in research and with academia as well. And we have a partnership with the University of Strathclyde, and what we wanted to look at really was these sustainable development goals. Enjoy the Air actually covers quite a few of them. And if you look at Glasgow, it doesn't have an air quality problem, but it does have a transport problem. And can you try and solve that on its own? Or is it like a big system and interwoven as a big Venn diagram with other things that are going on and energy? So what changes would we have to make to Glasgow to do that? And how would we get those citizens to buy into it? But not just that, if that was a solution for Glasgow, actually, what about it is a niche, and what is it that you could take as guiding principles to get peer-to-peer learning over other cities? And we've already touched on people like cities like Birmingham, and I know Nottingham and Bath, and that all around the clean air zones, and having done different modes of transport. So if you have a look at this as what the motivators are for the individual, and then also what the city requires to have, there's quite a mix of them, and the data is actually quite separate. So how do you get that in there? And at the moment, you can see that you could have a good infrastructure, you could have good parking, good different transport and everything else, but you also have a lot of car users. So how do you get those car users out? How do you provide other modes? And how do you know that what you're doing is actually what people want? So it's that feedback loop. This to us is the main bit of it, of actually you could create behavior change, but how do you know it's the right behavior change? How are you measuring it? And actually what you measure also drives different behavior, but it's not a one-on-one feedback loop. There are quite a few people in this, the government, the transport purchaser, there's lots of policies, there's the suppliers we've talked about. So we've come up again with looking at this as a community, and hence the unite of how we could get different people on different baby steps, I guess, or marginal gains would be another way, or nudge is what I heard that the UK government have looked at for behaviour change, and I believe Scotland have used the ISM methodology for behaviour. But it's how do we get these patterns and grow them as people certainly return to work as a result of the pandemic. Also, it's how do you organise that data? So again, that sort of engineering side of how do you get the systems thinking of it? How do you take all those chaotic experiences? So yes, you could get people to fill in surveys. How do you organise that data? And how do you extract the important bits, picking up on what Alex and the others have said about the multimodal side, the type of people they are they concessionary? Have they got access to IT? Why are they going into the cities? And also, what has their experience been like and the time of that journey? So part of that feedback actually is around recognizing that people have made a change, and how do you incentivize them to do it? So there is an option for people to sort of start saying of actually, I would have used the train, but I couldn't park, so I just drove my car in, and then providing some advice and actions of how their behavior would work, would change, and therefore benefit from it. So we have a series within Enjoy the Air, so for the uniting actually around all the cities, to come together to share that best practice amongst each other, so that we get a commonality in that across the country. Also a certification grade that looks at not just transport but air quality and other things that are interlinked within the Venn diagram of the city system of how they can nudge towards this certification of a greener city for all, and then recognizing those people that live there that have made the choices and the changes. There you go, Ali. You're on mute now.
Sorry, I lost things there a little bit. Never mind, I'm back.
Okay.
I don't know how, but there we are. Okay, thank you to all of our panelists then for giving us that kind of introduction and context and a flavour of their perspectives on this topic of transport behaviour and where MaaS may be able to help. We're now going to move on to the panel session part of today's session, which will be a kind of Q&A. So very much encourage you to submit questions to our panelists through the chat function. I am trying to keep on top of things as they come through, and I can see there's been a bit of conversation already, which is great through the chat. And actually, I'm going to build on some of the conversations happening already as part of the first question to the panel, because we had talked and we kind of built a question around how to articulate the benefits of MaaS to the end user, but I think it was Steve Cassidy who made the very good point earlier in that chat that is mobility as a service, or MaaS, even the right term? And is that something that we should even be using when engaging with users? So I'd like to use that as the kind of basis for the question around how we improve the messaging around MaaS, and what we do to make it both kind of digestible but also relevant to those who may ultimately be using it. So I wonder, Alex, if we could touch on that topic first of all with you, around how we improve the messaging related to MaaS.
Yeah, thanks, Ali. Can I just say, first of all, I've got to issue a correction, because apparently there are 14 rail stations in the UK that are inaccessible by road. So actually the problem's worse than I said it was. So I'm happy to be corrected on that. Yeah, look, I honestly, I think mobility as a service is a term that, as with so many technical things, like we throw it around inside the industry. I don't think it's a customer facing term. I think it's confusing. I think we assume an over engagement from people with the ticketing and transport services they interact with. You know, I'd much prefer to see stronger local branding. You know, going back to Oyster, like Oyster was a fantastic invention in terms of getting people to understand how the service worked, what was involved by just putting it all under that one banner. Yeah, I wouldn't want to see the term mobility as a service in any customer facing materials. I think it's too confusing. You're creating questions that customer doesn't really need answering. And also, I do think even within the industry, I think it potentially runs the risk of conflating mobility as a service with subscriptions. There's lots of people I talk to who immediately jump to assuming it is a subscription service, like an all-you-can-eat type deal. And obviously it can be, but it doesn't have to be. And I think realistically, commercially, it's not going to be for the near future. So yeah, you know, we can use it all day. Like it's the easy shorthand for us to understand the sort of areas we're talking in. Although again, if you ask 20 people for a definition, I think you'll get 20 different definitions. But I wouldn't want to see it in customer materials.
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree, and it's somebody who's tried to explain MaaS to friends in the pub. It's soul destroying. So I think we have to get better at doing that. Beata, I wonder if I could come to you next on that similar question, but also from speaking to others who have been looking at MaaS pilots, kind of internationally, actually, often it seems that the what differentiates success and failure has come down to the messaging and marketing round about it. So I wonder if more broadly on the messaging thing, but also maybe in your experience of some of these more international projects, if you've seen that being played out.
Yeah, I think, I mean, it's like the oyster that Alex mentioned. The things that really work are those that are dead simple to catch as a concept, like the Viennese Jahreskarte, which is just a year's card. And the year's card gives you access to all sorts of transport throughout the entire city-state of Vienna. And it's building on something that people understand. I think the issue then comes as like, when you think about, well, what we really want is someone to swap their car for this service. But I think we're in this sort of transitional period. We had 70, it depends where you start counting from, but you had 70 years of car adoption. You know, our behaviour change as a society has gone from not having cars to being completely dependent on them, or almost completely dependent on them. And that took us about 70 years. We've got about 10 years to completely roll that back. So in some senses, we've got to really kind of like accelerate how things are offered, what we expect of people. So, you know, giving people dead easy things to use, like the Jahreskarte. The other very important thing is that it works out at €1 a day. So about something ridiculous is like 850,000 Viennese people have a Jahreskarte, because it's sorry, my numbers are completely off there, but anyway, lots of people have this because it's dead cheap, so they use it, and at some point, you know, you're going to want to change to increase the use and substitute it more for cars, but that's has to come down the line. We have to prove that the alternatives are there before we can start to say, no, don't use, you know, be more kind of prescriptive about use this as a subscription instead of a car. So I think that, yeah, I think there's that's kind of direct substitution that has happened in some places is harder to sell than, look, there's something that's really good and really easy to use all over the place. I mean, yeah, and I think the other thing is about different cohorts adopting different things. I think cards are really easy for some societies to, you know, to accept. The RFID cards seem to be really well adopted in Germany and you know, German speaking countries, whereas they were great in London. Some apps seem to be a bit slower in some places and more, but more. We tend to be less cash. We tend to be more cashless in the UK and more app friendly. So, you know, there's different sort of variations between countries on what people will do as well.
Thank you for that. Matt has pointed out in the chat, and he's probably right, that maybe my issue is I've been trying to explain MaaS to people in the pub, and maybe it'd be easier if I was trying to explain it to people who maybe hadn't had a few drinks, and he's probably right on that one, to be perfectly honest. Well, I still think it would be a challenge. Melinda, I want to maybe come to you next, because I'm interested in exploring what Beata just touched on there around, yes, it's messaging, but it's messaging related particularly to the car user, and you touched on that in your presentation, and the ability of MaaS as a way of introducing new modes. And I quite like that concept, that if we're thinking of this as any kind of transition, then what we really need to do is, first of all, it's an awareness. First of all, are you aware that there are other options that you can do? And MaaS is obviously good at that. And then there's making it easier to do that. And it's not meant as being a direct replacement for the car, but perhaps just allows that transition from that.
Yeah, and I can also just echo what everyone in front of me said about the whole messaging around MaaS, and actually the term mobility as a service doesn't really make any sense if you're doing anything user facing. But then some people in the chat also mentioned that, is that even the right term to discuss in the business world and the transportation world? And I think that's a very heated topic outside there right now, and I actually don't know the right answer to that, but I don't think there is a very clear answer. But in my mind, I think it doesn't actually matter what we call it in the transportation world, not towards users. Users is a completely different thing. It's the understanding about what we mean by that. You can call it anything. You could call it hippopotamus if you want. It's what we actually mean by it. I don't want anyone calling it hippopotamus now, but yeah, so that's one point. So you were mentioning about this introducing new modes and how MaaS can do that. And I think something that's really important to acknowledge is that, especially coming back to the fact that transportation is habitual, trying to get people to change everything they do all of a sudden and use completely new transportation modes, completely change their behavior, is going to be quite an extreme jump. So we may need to do it in bits and in steps. And so maybe actually the fact that they even see the availability of some of these new transportation modes is the first step. That doesn't necessarily mean they all of a sudden ditch their car completely and just jump on an electric bike or any other service, but it's rather that first step of them even understanding that that's out there and that that is an option for them. And then a second step is for them to make that step to actually change their behavior. So I think we need to be a little bit careful with how extreme we go in that, okay, we're going to completely disrupt the travel behavior. Everyone who's in a car right now is tomorrow going to be cycling around the city. That's, in reality, that's not going to happen. So what steps do we focus on to get there first? And I think the first step of that is actually information and understanding about the alternatives. Don't actually know whether I answered your question, but that was a point I could make.
I think it does, and I would agree that I think information is absolutely key. And Kate, that sort of touches on a little bit what you were mentioning about the use of data and how we use that and how we, obviously data is the savior of everything, right? But which it may or may not be, but it has to be used correctly. And I thought you made interesting points about, yes, there's lots of data there in different areas that we could use. And do you think that that is a tool that will support what we're trying to do here in terms of engaging with people beyond your typical transport, your typical public transport user?
Yes, but not in isolation. I think that's the key, because you can look at data through whatever lens you want to. So I think you need to look at, if you pick, at the moment we've just done this through the lens of MaaS, but actually if you wanted to do the cross section of it, which is why we picked like the urban infrastructure, the inner urban environment, actually have a look at everything that affects that ecosystem, because you could make a system that goes on endlessly. You have to bound it, but you also have to know which taps you can turn on and off and what the impact of those taps are. I wanted to pick up on actually something just said about making changes. Actually, it's been easy to give people something. So giving somebody the car has been good. Taking something away from somebody is really, really, really difficult. And people have said, I think you and I had a discussion actually, that the cost of public transport has come down a lot. Why are people not paying, taking in that fact? But if you're paying to run a car, it's then the cost of running a car and the cost of the public transport. It's not seen as an either or, it's an addition on top. So it's an additional cost that they incur. I think that needs to be highlighted as well.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think also there is, we've talked about this before in MaaS sessions in the past, that there's also often a kind of misunderstanding of the cost of the car. And people, it's a sunk cost that sits there and they don't really think about it. And then everything is just on top of that. But of course, that, which is true, but it's not necessarily a fair reflection. So I wanted to touch on just in a minute on this idea of MaaSing alongside other sort of policies or initiatives to kind of elicit behavioural change. But I wanted to touch on a point that Anna's made in the chat. I think it's quite an interesting one. So it's a kind of open question to our panelists as to whether you've looked at any other industries or sectors to get inspiration on how travel behaviour might change. And Anna's pointed out the kind of transitions around things like veganism and smoking, which have, the attitudes towards both of these things have changed quite dramatically, I would say. Smoking's maybe taken a bit longer, but veganism has been very much a shorter term thing. So is there any lessons to be learned from adjacent sectors, I think is the kind of open question there, if anybody wants to take it on.
Yeah, I'll definitely take that one, Ollie. So prior to being in transport, I was an innovation consultant, whatever you want to, whatever you think of consultants, and we did loads of work with Procter & Gamble on sustainability and how to incentivize behavior change. And I think what was really interesting with all of that is the sort of there's a 3-stage model to getting people, for example, to recycle. So first is awareness that, for example, sustainable options exist. Then second is motivation, and typically that's some kind of ideological change. You have to be one of the people that cares, you know, not one of the people that thinks that global warming is a myth. But then the third one, and the most important one, was convenience. And the problem is that change is made for an ideological stand in the general public. You know, if they feel guilty, basically, and sort of guilted into sustainable behaviors, which I think is what we're seeing a lot more of, a sort of general understanding of, well, I should probably be doing something like this. This is actually pretty bad now. It doesn't stick. It sticks for a while, but because, you know, taking your bottle back to the supermarket and getting refilled, that's great. You do that twice, and then the next time you left the house and you go, oh, I forgot my bottle. I'll just buy one, you know. And actually, interestingly, bathroom products are by far the least recycled of all of the products in the home, because most people don't have a recycling bin in the bathroom, and they can't be bothered to take it down the stairs and put it in the kitchen recycling bin. So there's a huge gap between what people want to do and the convenience of you know, the impact on their life that it has. And I think that transfers, you know, over perfectly. I think we're in a good place with, like, most people are aware, you know, that public transport is good and car driving is bad. But if we can't replicate that convenience, we're always going to struggle to make it stick. And I think we're going to get a lot of people coming into a MaaS scheme, potentially trying it out because there's some incentive, like we give them 50 quid's worth of free credit. They're going to use it for a bit and feel quite good about themselves, but then they're going to come across those scenarios where they need to go back to the car for whatever reason, and then, you know, they'll sort of drop out of it. And it's, you know, it's the challenge that all sort of acquisition based businesses have, is it's easy to get people to try it if you bribe them, but how do you get it to stick? And I think, to go back to the point about the cost of a car, I think the problem is that it's a sunk cost that people don't necessarily fully accept, you know, the total value of it. But if, you know, I can't buy my insurance for a month, I mean, I possibly can through some of those pay-as-you-go things, but, like, you know, if I need a car once in a year, I've sunk road cost, insurance, you know, those are also, for me, it's like the marginal cost is actually, I've basically got once a year I can decide to lose my car or not. And if at any point in that year I'm like, oh, you know, it'd be really useful to go to IKEA and have a big boot, we're going to lose that convenience factor, and they're just going to fall back into the bad habits. So yeah, definitely, I think we're not great in transport, if I'm honest, at inspiring behavior change, because we're used to being, like, we haven't necessarily had to try too hard to win customers. I think, you know, if you want to get from A to B, you're taking the bus if you can't afford a car, right? But now we're saying, actually, we do have to start to win customers. We have to start to think like marketing teams, and, you know, again, local authorities aren't really set up for that, so we need to bring in external expertise. So there's lots of interesting stuff going on in other industries, but I think, unfortunately, it's much easier to get someone to switch to recyclable plastic than it is to drop their car, and I think that's the challenge that we've got.
Can I just jump in for a second? Something you said, Alex, really sparked an very old memory in my mind, and I think it's applicable here. But you were talking about returning bottles, and I'm from Eastern Europe, and back when I was a child, I remember we got money in return for returning bottles, and that created a culture where everyone was doing it. All of my friends were doing it, all of their families, all of their parents, everyone was doing it. It wasn't a massive amount of money, it was tiny, but it was the thing that everyone started doing. I went back to where I'm from not that long ago. This system isn't in place anymore. Recycling bottles is not a thing anymore. Just that tiny little bit of slightly harder measure, or that little bit of incentive to do that made a humongous difference. I'm completely with you. Incentivizing recycling versus change of transport behavior is not the same, but this comes back to that discussion of we need to bring in other measures, other harder measures, potentially monetary things, either to help pull people to better behavior or push them away from bad behavior. So to disincentivizing the car, for example. So there definitely are lessons to be learned from other sectors. I'm sure there's a lot of other ones out there. This just sparked a weird memory in my mind and took me back to my childhood. Thanks, Alex. That was it, Alex.
I would add, actually, as well, people will buy their way out the problem. So these clean air zones that have come in I live not that far away from Bath, actually, and theirs has sparked an awful lot on their Facebook group about the fact they're penalising, say, the plumbers or the people who need to drive through the city because there are no other modes in place or anything else, so they have to pay. So actually, it's not seen as doing something better for sustainability. It's seen as a money-making scheme by the local government, and therefore is now having the opposite effect.
Yeah, it's like speed cameras, isn't it? It's, you know, it's seen as the enemy, and they're just going to spend it on rebranding.
I want to touch on that. Sorry, Beata, because I'll let you come in just a second, because I think it will probably follow on from this. But the point's been made in the chat as well, and I liked what you were saying about convenience, Alex, and that example about the shampoo bottles and stuff, I guess, shows the inherent laziness of the human being, that level of convenience is something that we're not going to stick with. And I guess the reality is that, you know, shared and integrated transport is never going to be as convenient as the car. There's very difficult to find a way that can be more convenient than dropping in a car that's in your drive and go straight from A to B, congestion aside. So the convenience argument is never really going to quite hold. So then we have to start getting into the incentivization and disincentivization of using the car and using other modes, and how these different carrots and sticks work together. Things like, you know, parking levies, congestion charging, low emission zones on one side, things like maybe scrappage schemes and MaaS perhaps on the other side. So Beata, I'll let you come back on the comment I think you were going to make, but also if you could touch on where you think MaaS sits within a kind of broader toolbox of initiatives, that would be great as well.
Yes, it's an interesting one, because I think that the convenience of a car has become a bit taken for granted in terms of people flout the laws around cars quite considerably, and that actually is to the detriment of everyone's health and well-being. If you live on a busy road, I've just moved onto a busy road, so I'm acutely aware of this at the moment, it actually has a really big impact on your mental health if there's a lot of speeding cars. And I think one of the things that we've become inured to as a society is that idea that the convenience of a car is maximised for everyone. And, you know, if you're going 35 miles an hour, that's fine in a 30 mile an hour. If you're going 25 miles an hour, that's fine in a 20 mile an hour zone. And I think actually some of these evening outs of differentials between modes could be assisted at least by being a lot more strict about things like road rules, speed limits, not overtaking on narrow country lanes and things like that. A general acceptance that this isn't an instantaneous solution to getting from A to B. I think transport's really interesting because it's on that intersection of two things that are enormously important to us. One is time and the other is money. And we basically have this kind of like time money. Every time you get into a car, you're kind of slightly doing that calculation. Every time you get onto a bus, you're slightly doing that calculation, even if you're not a particularly nerdy person like me. There's still that kind of like, well, you know, I need to get there quickly because all these things will work better if I get there more quickly. So I think that there's a slight sense of entitlement that arises once you get into those kinds of equations. And I think one of the things that's interesting about COVID is that everyone got to take a step back in when during lockdown, a lot of people got to go, oh right, okay, I don't have to be anywhere in a certain amount of time because I can't go anywhere, and it was and the difference in people's attitudes was quite really interesting, really interesting. And I think some of the things that we struggle with in transport is actually people's time pressures, people's financial pressures, and people's sense of struggling. And so there are larger issues in society which we end up trying to contend with mobility as a service. Yes, it's a tool. We can say, oh yeah, you've got a bus, or, you know, look, there's a really convenient demand responsive transport bus that will come and pick your kids up and take them to Scouts and bring them back from Scouts. Brilliant. That could actually be quite a big solution for some parents. But I think, you know, we always have to recognise that in some ways the transport system we've got is a reflection of the society we've got, and sometimes vice versa.
Okay, thanks. Melinda, since you raised it particularly in your presentation, I wonder if you just want to touch on that sort of, as I say, toolkit of initiatives or policies, I guess, that could be in place. Are we hard enough for the stick? Should we be doing more of that? And can MaaS help to sort of appease the angry motorist in particular, or transport user, by providing some incentivization and reward for, let's call it, good behaviour?
I think we're moving in the right direction, but there's still a lot of different things to do. And I think you use the word toolkit, and I think that's very, very appropriate, because that means that there isn't one single solution that's going to work everywhere. In some cities, potentially congestion charging will make all the difference. In other cities, that's not going to be enough. In some places, you have to put in I don't know, parking frees or no parking zones or other different measures like this. But it's also important to identify the two sides of the coin. One is the carrots and the other one. So one of the sticks, these things that are trying to deter private vehicle use, but then the other one is the carrot. So how do you make the alternatives more attractive? And there's been quite a lot of discussion here about time and cost. And cost is a big question here, but obviously then there's a whole business aspect to it of how you actually make these modes more attractive. In some countries, they've made public transport completely free, or free for certain population segments, and there's different way around that. But then there's always the question of who's going to pay for it, because these are businesses. So I really do think that this is a toolkit, and we have to think about it that way. And just because in one city or in one area, I keep on saying city, but area in general, certain measures worked really, really well, that doesn't mean that if you move the same batch of measures somewhere else, it's going to work. It's likely not, because they're not the same. And MaaS does have a role to play in this, but it has to be part of the discussion. And I think this was mentioned somewhere in all the discussions, but it has to be bringing all these actors and the whole ecosystem around the table and making sure that the different measures, alongside MaaS and other services, discuss together and come up with a solution together that works together, rather than different things being plugged in that may actually contradict each other. So it has to be a range of measures, and this is where it's really important. And I know how difficult this is. I know it's easier to say than actually do, but bring those decision makers, bring those stakeholders around the table and come up with solutions together.
Thanks, Melinda. I think this is something that we're going to touch on more at our third session, where we're looking at policy and governance around MaaS. So I think we'll expand on that. I want to move on to another topic, because I know it's going to mean a lot to people, a lot of people on this call, because it's such a big part of Scottish transport, and that's the rural element. And I think most of our speakers touched on that a little bit in their introductory pieces, and the conversation has naturally gone down a sort of urban focus. But we have, as won't have escaped the attention of most people, we have large rural areas in Scotland. I think it's interesting and quite encouraging that of the 4 MaaS Investment Fund projects currently being coordinated through Transport Scotland, they all have a significant rural focus as part of that, which I think is also great. But how do we begin to, I guess, develop what we've talked about here, which is mostly an urban focus, and apply that into rural areas? And is there the same application, or is it a completely different beast? Alex, I wonder if I can start with you on that one, simply because you had that lovely picture of Connor Station, but how you see MaaS being, I guess, implemented in these lower density population areas.
I mean, honestly, this is the one I think I have the least. I think this is the hardest problem. Like, ultimately, I think it comes down to we're going to have to throw a lot of money at the problem, and whether that is infrastructure, whether that is subsidization of clearly unprofitable services. I mean, obviously, demand responsive transport has, I think, the best shot at being the answer for rural services. But even that, I mean, you need the demand, right? And I think the problem is, to use the word of the day, lumpy. Like, you're not going to have that's the whole problem with rural bus services, right? It's at the moment people have to modify their behavior around the 2 buses a day. I think even if we made that on demand, you're still going to have to be waiting for, you have to get your neighbours all together and all do the app at the same time in order to make it worthwhile for the DRT companies. So I honestly can only think that the way out of it is to throw money at the problem and to subsidize what will clearly be unprofitable public transport situations. I guess there's also the question of, the park and ride doesn't get a lot of attention, but it is a really useful tool for reducing congestion. Like, I don't think many people consider it. And again, maybe it comes back to making parking in the city centre harder, in order to sort of stick people into using the park and ride. Yeah, honestly, I wish I had an answer, and I'm interested to hear the people that know a lot more about this than me jump in, because it's by far the hardest problem, I think.
Well, I'm sure Beata will want to jump in on this, and I will just in a second, but I completely agree with you. I think there's often almost an unfair pressure put on MaaS to somehow make the unprofitable profitable, and I think that's just not going to happen. But what can it do to perhaps support some of the changes you'd like to see? Beata?
I think, yes, the example of France, which I've been looking at, is really quite instructive. First of all, France has a legal obligation for areas to provide mobility, public transport to their populace now, and if you live in France, you have a legal right to public transport, which then means that if you live in one of these sparsely populated areas, the general acceptance in France is that they will subsidise around about 20 to 25 euros per trip on DRT. That is the bottom line, and then this is the French metric. Is then if your DRT company is great and encourages demand and optimises its services to such an extent that it drops that subsidy down to €8 per passenger, then they'll put in a subsidised fixed bus route. And that is the acceptance. It's not, we will make this into a profitable service. It's we will use DRT to make a very expensive service, and the capabilities of DRT operators to reduce that expensive service down to a lower subsidy per passenger, and then we'll put in a probably equally subsidised fixed bus route. And so you've got a completely different metric to the one that you have in the UK. In terms of subsidising it, and as Alex says, you cannot expect something to MaaS, a piece of technology, to make an unprofitable system profitable. You can optimise things for sure, but you can't suddenly create that demand. The other thing that I wanted to say was, though, when I looked at Manchester, I was really struck by the fact that fewer people drive in the centre of the city, but yet hundreds of thousands of cars arrive in the centre of the city every day. So there is a kind of equity between the surrounding areas and the centre of Manchester, that people in Manchester drive less, they live there, they should be reaping the benefit of not of driving less in terms of air quality, but no, they don't. They suffer from the lack of provision in the surrounding areas. So I don't know if there's an equity solution that you can think of by taking areas more as a whole. That's the other way of looking, cutting cakes to shaking the dice, whatever metaphor you want to use.
We love a mixed metaphor in these calls. That's absolutely perfect. That's great. Thanks, Beata. Just to point out, there is an awful lot of stuff getting put into the chat that I'm sort of struggling to keep up with, if I'm completely honest. So I do encourage you, as you listen to our speakers, to also read through, because there's lots of good comments being made in there as well. So rural is going to be a challenge. Anybody else want to come in on rural, or are we too scared to tackle that? That's Kate.
Well, around us, if you think of Oxford, people rarely take cars in. Actually, they use the park and ride an awful lot. Actually, Bath as well. If you go in for the day, again, they've got enough park and ride from each side of the city to make it worthwhile. I think you're going to end up with some form of hub and spoke solution of getting people to a certain point. And I think you are going to end up splitting it into two forms of transport. You're going to have that inner urban bit, and then the rural and the spokes that come into and take people to the outskirts. And then there's another MaaS system within it. I think that's in my head, that's the way it's going.
Yeah, I had something really similar noted down, that what Kate said, and I also agree with Alex, is that the business side of rural MaaS is much more challenging because you don't have the economies of scale. But the thing about that in urban areas we talk about door-to-door solutions. In rural areas, what we may need to think about is hub-to-hub solutions. initially at least, and that may be something slightly easier to tackle at first, but that's just my slightly naive suggestion. I'm not an expert in rural MaaS whatsoever.
Okay,
That
thanks,
depends
guys.
if someone's thinking of a great ta-da solution that's going to solve anything, or if you go for the marginal gains and people are accepting you haven't got that Uber app thing right, you are going to have to try different stuff. And as we said about things going from city to city, there isn't one size that fits all, hence the guiding principles. If you could overlay that of what's worked based on your current ecosystem, then you're more likely to get something that will work for you.
Thanks, Kate. I say if rural transport is of interest, and rural MaaS in particular, that there is an event that we're supporting next week, run by the Scottish Rural Island Transport Committee. Their annual gathering is online week tomorrow, so that's the 30th of September. So if rural transport is something you'd like to discuss further, then I'd absolutely encourage you to go along to that. If you just Google Scottish Rural Island Transport Committee, you'll be able to find that. Okay, we are close to running out of time. So in fact, I think we probably are just about out of time. So I don't want to keep people longer than we said than we would. So I'll just begin to close off today's session. But and first of all, to thank everybody who's been involved, to our four panelists, to Alex, to Beata, to Melinda, and to Kate for providing their insight. I hope you guys that have been listening in have found it useful. It's certainly been great for me to be listening into. I think we know that behavioural change is going to be difficult when it comes to transport. We know that there's going to have to be a multiple solutions applied to do that. But I think we are also in agreement that MaaS, if done correctly, is going to be a key component of that. And I think we just have to begin to develop that and work with these pilot projects to understand exactly how that works in the real world and how that will progress in future. But yes, so thank you all for joining us today. A reminder that this session and all our sessions actually in the conference are recorded, so you will be able to listen back to these at your leisure. At some point in the future. There'll be details sent out to you. It'll be up on our website and YouTube channel. If you want to get in touch with me or with MaaS Scotland in general, then by all means do. Always interested in speaking to people. And a reminder as well that there are still 2 sessions in this year's online series to come. We take a little break next week, and then we're back with 2 sessions the following week. Session 3 looking at governance frameworks and policy on the 5th of October, and then session 4, which is a broader panel session looking at, well, it's called the Road to COP26. It should really be called the Road from COP26, because we're looking at how MaaS can support sustainable transport future beyond COP, obviously, and in the decades to come, and that's on the 7th of October. Should be a really interesting chat as well. But that's it from us. Thank you again for tuning in, and yeah, I hope to see you at the next sessions and maybe even face-to-face at some point in the future. Thanks to everyone.